The morning sun filtered through the dusty windows of the small Florentine library where Marco first discovered the worn leather-bound manuscript that would change everything he thought he knew about money and power. It was 1513, and Niccolò Machiavelli had just finished his most famous work, The Prince, but hidden within his personal correspondence and lesser-known writings lay financial wisdom that would prove more valuable than any treasure chest. Marco, a young merchant struggling to establish himself in Florence's competitive trade environment, had spent months barely breaking even despite working dawn to dusk. His father's bakery had failed, his mother's textile business had crumbled under debt, and he was determined not to follow the same path. What he found in those yellowed pages would reshape not just his understanding of commerce, but the very foundation of how wealth is created and preserved. The manuscript contained 3 distinct sections of Machiavelli's financial philosophy, each building upon the last like the careful construction of a fortress. As Marco read through the night by flickering candlelight, he began to understand why so many of his contemporaries remained trapped in cycles of poverty while others seemed to effortlessly accumulate wealth and influence. The first lesson that struck Marco like lightning was Machiavelli's assertion that money is not the end, but the means to an end, and those who mistake the means for the end will find themselves powerless despite their wealth. This wasn't merely philosophical musing. It was practical wisdom born from observing the rise and fall of powerful families throughout Italy. Marco remembered his neighbor, Lorenzo, who had inherited a substantial sum from his deceased uncle but had squandered it within 2 years on lavish displays of wealth. Lorenzo had bought expensive clothing, hosted elaborate feasts, and purchased a grand house that he couldn't afford to maintain. He had treated money as a trophy rather than a tool, and now worked as a clerk for the very merchants who had once sought his favor. Machiavelli's insight went deeper. He observed that true financial power came not from accumulating coins but from understanding the invisible networks of obligation, trust, and reciprocity that governed commerce. In Renaissance Italy, a merchant's word was worth more than gold because it could open doors that no amount of currency could unlock. The manuscript revealed how Machiavelli had advised the Medici family on financial strategy, emphasizing that every transaction should serve multiple purposes. When Giovanni de' Medici lent money to struggling nobles, he wasn't simply earning interest, he was creating a web of dependencies that would serve the family's political ambitions for generations. The loan was an investment in influence, the interest was merely a bonus. Marco began to see his own financial struggles through this new lens. He had been thinking like Lorenzo, focused on immediate gains and personal comfort, rather than understanding money as a tool for creating long-term strategic advantages. His failed attempts at quick profits in the wool trade suddenly made sense. He had been playing checkers while others were playing chess. The manuscript detailed how Machiavelli had observed successful merchants who never appeared wealthy but controlled vast networks of trade and information. They lived modestly, dressed simply, and yet wielded enormous influence because they understood that ostentatious wealth made one a target while hidden wealth provided security and flexibility. One particular story captured Marco's imagination. Machiavelli wrote of a silk merchant named Antonio who had turned a modest inheritance into a trading empire not through brilliant financial acumen, but through his understanding of human nature and strategic patience. When the Venetian trade routes were disrupted by conflict, most merchants panicked and sold their goods at a loss. Antonio quietly bought up these discounted goods and stored them, knowing that the disruption was temporary and demand would return stronger than ever. But Antonio's brilliance lay not in the purchase itself, but in how he financed it. Rather than using his own capital, he approached struggling merchants and offered them a partnership. He would provide storage and wait for better prices in exchange for a percentage of the eventual profits. This strategy required no significant capital investment from Antonio, spread the risk among multiple partners, and created a network of merchants who now had a vested interest in his success. When the trade routes reopened, Antonio's network controlled a significant portion of the available silk, allowing them to command premium prices. His partners made substantial profits, Antonio earned his percentage without risking his own capital, and, most importantly, he had created a loyal network of merchants who would prioritize his future ventures. Marco realized that his own approach to commerce had been fundamentally flawed. He had been trying to succeed through individual effort and superior products, but Machiavelli's insights revealed that sustainable financial success required understanding the social and psychological dimensions of wealth creation. The manuscript emphasized that money flows toward those who provide value beyond the immediate transaction. The most successful merchants weren't those who offered the cheapest goods or the highest quality, but those who solved problems their customers didn't even realize they had. They anticipated needs, created efficiencies, and positioned themselves as indispensable partners rather than mere vendors. This principle extended beyond commerce into investment philosophy. Machiavelli observed that the wealthy didn't simply save money, they converted it into assets that would generate future opportunities. Land provided not just rental income but political influence through tenant relationships. Shares in trading ventures created access to information about market conditions. Even charitable contributions served strategic purposes, building reputation and creating networks of gratitude. The concept of compound growth wasn't limited to financial returns, it applied to relationships, reputation, and knowledge. Every interaction was an investment in future possibilities, and those who understood this principle found themselves with access to opportunities that weren't available to the general public. Marco began to see that his financial education had been backwards. He had learned about accounting, pricing, and inventory management, but nothing about the human elements that drove financial success. Machiavelli's observations revealed that money was ultimately about psychology, trust, and strategic thinking rather than mathematical formulas. The manuscript contained detailed analysis of why certain business ventures succeeded while others failed, and the patterns were striking. Failed ventures almost always resulted from focusing on the product or service rather than understanding the broader ecosystem in which they operated. Successful ventures, by contrast, were built around deep understanding of human motivations, market dynamics, and long-term trends. One particularly insightful observation was Machiavelli's analysis of the banking revolution that had made Florence wealthy. The innovation wasn't in lending money, civilizations had been doing that for millennia. The breakthrough was in creating systems that made lending safer and more profitable through diversification, standardization, and legal frameworks that protected creditors. The Medici banks succeeded not because they had more money to lend, but because they had developed better systems for evaluating risk, managing portfolios, and recovering debts. They had turned money lending from a craft into a science, and their systematic approach allowed them to operate at a scale that individual moneylenders couldn't match. This lesson resonated deeply with Marco as he struggled with his own business challenges. He had been trying to compete on traditional dimensions like price and quality, but Machiavelli's insights suggested that sustainable advantages came from systematic approaches that others couldn't easily replicate. The manuscript revealed how truly wealthy individuals thought about money differently from those who struggled financially. They saw money as a renewable resource that could be multiplied through strategic application, rather than a scarce commodity that needed to be hoarded. This mindset difference wasn't philosophical, it was practical. Those who treated money as scarce tended to make defensive decisions that limited their growth potential, while those who understood its renewable nature made aggressive investments that created exponential returns. As Marco absorbed these insights, he began to understand why his family's businesses had failed. They had operated from a scarcity mindset, trying to protect what they had rather than strategically investing in growth opportunities. They had saved money instead of deploying it, avoided risk instead of managing it, and focused on preserving the status quo instead of creating new possibilities. The strategy of calculated risk. The second section of Machiavelli's manuscript dealt with what Marco would later recognize as the most counterintuitive aspect of wealth building, the strategic use of risk and uncertainty. Most people, Machiavelli observed, treated risk as something to be avoided, but the truly successful understood it as a tool to be wielded. The manuscript opened this section with a detailed analysis of the Venetian spice trade, which Machiavelli had studied during his diplomatic missions. Venice had become one of the wealthiest cities in the world not by avoiding the risks of long-distance trade, but by developing sophisticated systems for managing and distributing those risks among multiple parties. A typical spice voyage from Venice to Constantinople and back involved dozens of potential disasters, storms, pirates, political upheavals, currency fluctuations, and market changes. Any merchant who tried to manage all these risks alone would either go bankrupt from a single failed voyage or make such conservative choices that profits would be minimal. The Venetian solution was revolutionary in its sophistication. They created partnerships that spread risk across multiple investors, insurance systems that transferred specific risks to those best equipped to handle them, and diversified portfolios that ensured no single disaster could destroy their overall position. Most importantly, they developed information networks that allowed them to anticipate and adapt to changing conditions faster than their competitors. Marco had never considered risk as anything other than something to be feared and minimized. His family's approach had been to stick with proven methods, serve established customers, and avoid any ventures that couldn't be completely controlled. Machiavelli's analysis revealed this approach as not conservative but actually dangerous, because it left them vulnerable to changes they couldn't anticipate or control. The manuscript contained a detailed case study of two Florentine merchants who had started with similar resources but achieved vastly different outcomes. Francesco had invested all his capital in a single large textile workshop, believing that specialization would give him competitive advantages. Bernardo had divided his resources among several smaller ventures: textiles, wine trading, money changing, and property investment. When political conflicts disrupted the textile trade, Francesco lost everything because his entire business was vulnerable to a single point of failure. Bernardo's textile operation suffered the same losses, but his other ventures not only continued but actually benefited from the disruption as demand shifted to other goods and services. The key insight wasn't simply diversification, but understanding how different risks interacted with each other. Bernardo had chosen his investments not just for their individual merits, but because they responded differently to various types of market disruption. When textile trade declined, wine consumption often increased as people sought comfort. When political instability made trade risky, demand for money-changing services grew as merchants needed to convert currencies quickly. When commerce slowed, property values often fell, creating buying opportunities for those with liquid capital. Machiavelli's analysis went deeper into the psychology of risk management. He observed that most people made risk decisions based on fear rather than analysis, which led them to overestimate familiar risks while completely ignoring unfamiliar ones. Merchants who had experienced storms at sea would invest heavily in ship maintenance while completely ignoring the possibility of political changes that could make their entire trade route obsolete. The manuscript revealed how successful risk management required developing what Machiavelli called strategic paranoia, the ability to imagine and prepare for scenarios that seemed unlikely but would be catastrophic if they occurred. This wasn't about becoming paralyzed by fear, but about building resilience and flexibility into every venture. One of the most profound insights was Machiavelli's observation that the greatest risks were often hidden within apparent safety. Established businesses that seemed secure were often the most vulnerable because they had optimized for current conditions rather than preparing for change. New ventures that appeared risky might actually be safer because they were designed to adapt and evolve. Marco began to see his own conservative approach as actually increasing rather than decreasing his financial risk. By avoiding any ventures that seemed uncertain, he had made himself completely dependent on established patterns continuing indefinitely. He was like Francesco, with all his hopes concentrated in a single approach that could be destroyed by circumstances beyond his control. The manuscript detailed how Machiavelli had advised wealthy families to think about their portfolios like military commanders thinking about their forces. A good general never committed all his troops to a single battle, no matter how certain victories seemed. Instead, he kept reserves that could respond to unexpected developments, maintained multiple lines of communication, and prepared fallback positions that could be used if the primary strategy failed. This military analogy extended to the concept of strategic offense and defense. Purely defensive approaches might prevent immediate losses, but they guaranteed long-term defeat because they couldn't respond to changing conditions or take advantage of new opportunities. Successful wealth building required a combination of defensive measures that protected against catastrophic losses and offensive strategies that could create exponential gains. The manuscript revealed how truly sophisticated investors used what Machiavelli called asymmetric opportunities, situations where potential gains far exceeded potential losses, even if the probability of success was relatively low. The key was finding many such opportunities so that the few successes would more than compensate for the many failures. Marco was fascinated by Machiavelli's analysis of how the Medici family had used this principle to expand their influence throughout Europe. They had provided small loans to dozens of struggling nobles, knowing that most would default but calculating that the few who succeeded would become powerful allies whose value would far exceed the cost of the failed loans. This approach required a fundamental shift in thinking about failure. Instead of treating failed ventures as mistakes to be avoided, successful investors treated them as necessary costs of finding the few opportunities that would generate extraordinary returns. They failed quickly and cheaply, learning from each failure and using that knowledge to improve their selection criteria for future investments. The manuscript contained detailed analysis of how information asymmetries created investment opportunities for those who understood how to gather and interpret intelligence. Machiavelli had observed that markets often mispriced assets because participants had different levels of information about future developments. The most successful merchants weren't necessarily those with the most capital, but those with the best information networks. They cultivated relationships with travelers, diplomats, clergy, and other merchants who could provide early warning about political changes, crop failures, technological developments, and other factors that would affect market conditions. This intelligence gathering wasn't passive, it required systematic effort and strategic thinking. The most valuable information often came from sources that others overlooked: servants who overheard conversations, minor officials who processed documents, artisans who noticed changes in demand for their products. Building these networks required patience, reciprocity, and an understanding of human motivations that went far beyond simple commercial transactions. Marco realized that his isolation had been a major factor in his financial struggles. He had focused so intensely on his own business that he had neglected to build the relationships that could provide early warning about changes affecting his industry. He was operating blindly in a world where others had clear vision. The manuscript revealed how successful risk management also required understanding the difference between controllable and uncontrollable factors. Many merchants wasted enormous energy trying to influence factors beyond their control while neglecting opportunities to improve their responses to unchangeable conditions. Weather, politics, and market sentiment couldn't be controlled, but preparation for various scenarios could be planned and implemented. The most successful merchants spent their time developing flexible systems that could adapt to changing conditions rather than trying to predict or prevent those changes. This insight led to Machiavelli's principle of prepared opportunism, maintaining resources and capabilities that could be quickly deployed when unexpected opportunities arose. Most people were either too cautious to take advantage of sudden opportunities or too committed to existing plans to pivot when conditions changed. The manuscript detailed how some merchants had profited enormously from disasters that bankrupted their competitors, not because they had caused or predicted the disasters, but because they had maintained the flexibility and resources needed to respond quickly when others were paralyzed by uncertainty. The art of compound influence. The final section of Machiavelli's manuscript dealt with what he considered the ultimate financial strategy: building compound influence that created self-reinforcing cycles of wealth and power. This went far beyond simple compound interest. It was about creating systems where success generated additional opportunities for success at an accelerating rate. Marco found this section the most challenging to understand initially, because it required thinking about wealth in terms of networks and relationships rather than simple asset accumulation. Machiavelli's insights revealed how the truly wealthy didn't just own things, they occupied positions in social and economic systems that gave them disproportionate influence over how wealth flowed through society. The manuscript opened with an analysis of how the Catholic Church had become one of the wealthiest and most powerful institutions in Europe, despite taking vows of poverty and giving away enormous amounts of money. The Church's financial success came not from accumulating assets but from positioning itself as an indispensable intermediary in multiple systems of value exchange. Through its role in education, the Church controlled access to literacy and learning, making it essential for anyone seeking advancement in government or commerce. Through its moral authority, it influenced consumer behavior and business practices. Through its network of monasteries and churches, it created the medieval equivalent of banking and communication systems. Most importantly, through its promise of salvation, it had created a market for services that everyone needed but no one else could provide. The Church's wealth grew not through direct charging for services, but through its position at the center of medieval society's most important networks. Donations flowed naturally to an institution that provided essential services, and those donations funded expansion that created even more essential services, generating a virtuous cycle of growth and influence. Machiavelli's analysis revealed how this principle applied to secular wealth building as well. The most successful merchants weren't just selling goods, they were creating themselves as essential nodes in commercial networks. They became known as the people to contact for specific types of problems, and this reputation generated opportunities that others never learned about. The manuscript detailed the career of a Florentine merchant named Paolo who had transformed himself from a struggling cloth trader into one of the city's most influential commercial figures through strategic application of compound influence principles. Paolo had started by specializing not in selling cloth, but in solving the complex problems that arose in international textile trade. When disputes arose between merchants from different cities, Paolo offered arbitration services based on his growing knowledge of various commercial laws and customs. When language barriers complicated negotiations, he provided translation and cultural interpretation. When financing arrangements needed to be structured across multiple currencies and legal systems, he designed solutions that protected all parties. Over time, Paolo became known as the person to consult when complex textile deals needed to be structured. This reputation led to invitations to participate in larger and more profitable ventures as a partner rather than simply a service provider. His expertise became valuable enough that other merchants would offer him partnership stakes in exchange for his involvement in their deals. The key insight was that Paolo had created what Machiavelli called knowledge leverage, expertise that became more valuable as it was applied to larger and more complex problems. Unlike physical assets that could be depleted through use, knowledge assets grew stronger through application because each use provided new learning opportunities and expanded networks. Marco began to understand why his own efforts had been limited. He had been thinking about his business as selling products rather than building capabilities that could be applied to increasingly valuable problems. He had been competing on price and quality rather than developing unique expertise that customers couldn't find elsewhere. The manuscript revealed how compound influence worked through multiple interconnected mechanisms. Reputation generated opportunities, which generated experience, which enhanced reputation in a continuous cycle. Successful projects led to introductions to new clients, which expanded networks, which provided access to better projects. Knowledge gained from solving problems for one client could be applied to create solutions for other clients, making each subsequent engagement more profitable. Machiavelli observed that the most successful individuals didn't just accumulate these advantages randomly, they systematically designed their activities to maximize compound effects. They chose projects not just for their immediate profitability but for their potential to generate future opportunities. They cultivated relationships not just with current clients but with people who could become future clients or refer future business. The manuscript contained detailed analysis of how information and relationships created what modern economists would call network effects. Each additional connection made the entire network more valuable because it increased the number of potential combinations and opportunities. A merchant with relationships in 10 cities had access not just to 10 markets, but to the opportunities created by all possible combinations of those markets. This principle extended to knowledge accumulation as well. Learning about textile production didn't just improve textile business, combined with knowledge about shipping, it created opportunities in logistics. Combined with understanding of foreign markets, it enabled international expansion. Combined with financial expertise, it led to opportunities in trade financing. The manuscript revealed how the wealthiest families had systematically built what Machiavelli called capability platforms, combinations of knowledge, relationships, and resources that could be applied to multiple different opportunities. Instead of optimizing for success in any single venture, they optimized for the ability to succeed in whatever opportunities might arise. Marco realized that his focus on his immediate business problems had prevented him from building these longer-term capabilities. He had been so concerned with today's transactions that he hadn't invested in developing the expertise and relationships that would create tomorrow's opportunities. The manuscript detailed how compound influence required thinking about time differently than most people did. While others focused on quarterly results or annual profits, those building compound influence thought in terms of decades. They made investments that wouldn't pay off immediately but would create exponential returns over longer periods. This long-term perspective allowed them to make choices that seemed irrational to short-term thinkers but were strategically brilliant over extended periods. They would sometimes take lower profits on current deals in order to build relationships that would generate much larger profits in the future. They would invest time in learning about subjects that weren't immediately relevant to their current business but might become crucial as markets evolved. Machiavelli's analysis revealed how the most sophisticated practitioners of compound influence created what he called option value, positions that didn't generate immediate returns but created the right to participate in future opportunities. These might include relationships with emerging leaders, knowledge about developing technologies, or stakes in ventures that hadn't yet proven their value. The manuscript contained a fascinating case study of how the Medici family had used these principles to transform themselves from simple money changers into one of Europe's most powerful dynasties. Each generation had built upon the foundations laid by their predecessors, systematically expanding their influence in finance, politics, religion, and culture. The Medici understood that sustainable power required diversification across multiple domains. Financial wealth could be confiscated by political enemies, political power could be undermined by economic changes, but influence spread across multiple systems was nearly impossible to eliminate completely. They cultivated artists, funded scholars, influenced religious leaders, and built relationships with merchants throughout Europe. When they faced challenges in any single domain, they could draw on resources and support from the others. Their investments in culture and learning generated prestige that enhanced their commercial and political activities. Their commercial success funded political influence that protected their business interests. Marco began to see how his own narrow focus had made him vulnerable. He had put all his efforts into immediate commercial success without building the broader foundation of relationships and capabilities that could support long-term growth and provide security during difficult periods. The manuscript revealed how compound influence also worked through what Machiavelli called reciprocal value creation, the practice of structuring activities so that success for one party automatically generated benefits for others. This created natural allies who had vested interests in supporting continued success. Instead of thinking about business as zero-sum competition where one person's gain required another's loss, successful practitioners of compound influence created positive-sum relationships where everyone involved benefited from the overall success of their shared ventures. This approach generated what modern business theorists would recognize as sustainable competitive advantages. When customers, suppliers, employees, and partners all benefited from a business's success, they naturally worked to support and defend that business against competitors. The business became embedded in a network of mutually beneficial relationships that were difficult for competitors to replicate or disrupt. The manuscript concluded with Machiavelli's observation that compound influence ultimately transcended individual success to create lasting impact on society. Those who mastered these principles didn't just become wealthy, they shaped the development of entire industries and regions. They created institutions, established new practices, and influenced the direction of economic and social development in ways that continued long after their individual careers had ended. As Marco finished reading the manuscript as dawn broke over Florence, he understood that he had discovered more than just business advice. He had learned a completely different way of thinking about wealth, success, and human potential. The insights weren't just about making money, they were about understanding how value was created and distributed in human society, and how individuals could position themselves to participate in and influence those processes. The three sections of Machiavelli's financial philosophy worked together as an integrated system. Understanding money as a tool rather than an end provided the proper foundation for thinking about wealth. Mastering strategic risk management enabled the confident action necessary to build significant positions. Developing compound influence created self-reinforcing systems that generated exponential rather than linear growth. Marco closed the manuscript knowing that his life had been divided into before and after this moment. He now possessed knowledge that could transform not just his financial situation but his entire approach to living and working in the world. The question was whether he would have the courage and patience to apply these insights systematically over the years it would take to see their full effects. As he walked through the awakening city, Marco began to see everything differently. The merchants setting up their stalls weren't just selling goods, they were either building or missing opportunities to create compound influence. The conversations he overheard weren't just social interactions, they were information that could inform strategic decisions. The problems he observed weren't just difficulties to be avoided, they were opportunities for value creation that others might not recognize. The transformation had begun, and Marco knew there was no going back to his previous limited understanding of how wealth and influence actually worked in the world. Machiavelli's hidden insights had revealed the invisible architecture of success that operated behind the visible economy, and now Marco possessed the knowledge to navigate and, ultimately, master those hidden systems. Years later, when Marco had become one of Florence's most successful merchants and his story was told throughout Italy as an example of remarkable transformation, people would ask him for the secret of his success. He would always smile and tell them that the most valuable knowledge was often hidden in plain sight, waiting for those who had the wisdom to recognize its importance and the patience to apply it systematically over time. The manuscript that had changed his life remained in his private library, a reminder that true wealth wasn't measured only in gold and property, but in understanding the deeper principles that governed how human societies created and distributed value. Those who mastered these principles didn't just become wealthy, they became architects of their own destiny and influential forces in shaping the destiny of others. In the end, Marco realized that Machiavelli's greatest insight wasn't about money at all, but about human potential. The same principles that created financial success also created influence, impact, and the ability to contribute meaningfully to human flourishing. Money was indeed just a tool, but, in the hands of those who understood these deeper principles, it became a powerful instrument for creating positive change in the world. The lessons that would have altered his life if he had learned them earlier became the foundation for a life of greater purpose and achievement than he had ever imagined possible. And, perhaps most importantly, they became lessons he could pass on to others who were ready to discover their own potential for transformation and impact.